Lots of people know what a caboose is on a train. They've seen one before, at least if not in person, then maybe on TV or in cartoons. But not a lot of people actually know what cabooses are for and what kind of duties they served. Now, a caboose is a car that is usually set on the end of a train, and I'm going to be speaking in terms of American terminology and stuff because that's what I know basically is the American terminologies and things for cabooses. But essentially what a caboose was it was a special train car that served multiple duties. First and foremost, it allowed a place for the train crew to sleep. You see, in the early days of railroading, they would sometimes have to haul freight across long distances. And so depending on where they were going would depend on the size of the caboose and how many people were traveling with them. You see, because if it was a freight train, then sometimes the brakes would have to be operated by hand. They didn't have automatic brakes back then, especially in the early days of railroading. And so they would have the brakemen go up above the train and they would be stationed every couple of cars. And when the engineer would blow on the whistle for the train to apply brakes, the brakemen would go across the cars, slowly applying brakes to the train and allowing it to slow down, especially when going down steep grades. And so if those men were traveling across the country, they would need a place to sleep at night, a place to rest, especially the engineer crew. And so cabooses, especially the larger ones, they had spaces for the men to sleep. But let's say they weren't traveling long distances. Well, let's say they could make the end of the journey by the end of the day. Well, they would still need a caboose, and the caboose wouldn't necessarily have sleeping quarters in it, at least not all the time, but they would have chairs and things for people to rest. It would act as a break room for the train crew. So even if they weren't going somewhere that took multiple days, they would still need a place to rest and relax, and that's why there was often a potbelly stove inside a caboose, so that way they could heat up some food or some coffee or something. But cabooses also had another purpose. They also held tools and equipment for repairing the train. So let's say there was some kind of issue that they needed to fix really quickly. Let's say a brake chain was disconnected from a brake wheel because the chain maybe corroded and broke off. Well, they would keep extra chains for that. Or in the later years, when they actually used air brake power, sometimes the air brake hoses, they would just crack and leak air and the whole system would drain of air. And so it would make it really difficult in the early days to apply the brakes, but even in modern times it would make it difficult to release the brakes, depending on what kind of braking system you were using. And so they would keep extra brake hoses inside. So they had all kinds of tools and equipment for repairing the train aboard a caboose. They usually kept it in cabinets and such. But a lot of people will notice that cabooses often had this little compartment on the top. People say, well, what is that? Well, that is what's called a cupola. And if you're an architect fanatic, you might know the term cupola for a room or space on the very top of a building or a house that allowed you to look out and see a panoramic vista of the landscape around you. Well, the same thing went for cabooses. They had these cupolas on top sometimes, but it allowed the engineering crew or the brake crew, whoever was on the train at the time, they could sit up in the cupola and monitor what was happening on the train in front of them or behind them, depending on where the caboose was. They could monitor and see if there was some kind of smoke rising from the journals on the wheel axles. They could see if there was some kind of issue where a car was about to derail or if there was some kind of instability. And all of these things kind of helped because they could signal to the engineering crew. Sometimes the cabooses actually had a special air whistle. So the air brakes would supply an air hose into the caboose, and then if there was a problem and the people in the caboose needed to signal for the engineers to stop the train, they could blow a really loud whistle using the pressurized air, and the engineers at the front of the train could sometimes hear it and bring the train to a stop. So that was another reason for having a caboose, was monitoring what was happening on the rest of the train. And sometimes there just wasn't an ability to put a cupola on top of the caboose. So sometimes you'd see cabooses that had a kind of area that juts out the sides of the caboose, so that way they could sit and they could see around the train, around corners and things. So cabooses served several different kinds of duties. They were extremely useful for railroads. But then that makes you wonder, well, what happened to them? Where did they go? Well, basically, the answer is quite simple. It comes in the form of a flashing rear end device, or FRED as it's often called. FREDs were developed in the late last century because they needed to be able to save money on railroads. I mean, when you think about it, first of all, having all the crew that needs to be in a caboose and stuff, it's just extra people you have to pay, as well as the fact that it's another car you have to maintain. It's another car adding weight to the train. It's another car that needs to be monitored and maintained, and you have to build new ones when you need new ones. So it just was, cabooses just represented a lot of money, frankly. And so these flashing rear end devices operated off of a system that could tell the engineers at the front of the train exactly what was going on the train. They monitored the air brake pressure to figure out if there was a leak somewhere. They monitored the movement of the rear of the train, so that way it could relay information as to how fast the end of the train is moving, especially with our modern diesel trains, which are sometimes a mile long and can go up and over several hills at the same time because the train is so long. The rear end device would allow the engineers to know exactly what's happening to the end of the train, because a train is like a very long chain. Sometimes what happens to the front of the chain is not what's happening to the end of the chain. And so the rear end device actually is able to relay some of that information back to them. And also, of course, if there is an issue where the cars become uncoupled and there's a runaway train, that rear end device can actually track what's happening to the end of the train, where it's going, and relay that information as quickly as possible to the necessary authorities that will try to, bring the end of the train to a stop or try to prevent a disaster from happening. So rear end devices actually changed the way the industry worked, and it was no longer necessary to have cabooses on the ends of trains. Now, today, they're really more of a novelty, although there are some heritage railroads around the US that still use cabooses because obviously they're a heritage railroad. Maybe they're a steam railroad and they want to operate as realistically as possible. And so when they run their freight trains, they will often put a caboose at the very end, and the crew that manned the caboose would monitor the train just as they did in the olden days. And so there is still yet a need for cabooses, especially on heritage railroads. But they are not necessary on freight trains today. That being said, I'm not certain, but some people have told me that some modern day freight railroads still use a caboose. I have no idea what they would exactly need it for, but that's kind of cool to know. But nevertheless, that is what a caboose was for and why it kind of disappeared. And there are many other uses for a caboose. I'm sure I'm forgetting something. But frankly, they were just a really great multi-purpose tool that allowed the train crews to be able to monitor what's happening on the train and keep everything in working order. Well, anyway, folks, that's it for this episode today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned something new, a little bit about trains. There'll be more to come in the future. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye. Hey everyone, if you enjoy my content, consider supporting my channel by either signing up for my Patreon or my YouTube membership. This way, you can get exclusive perks in return. Now, in the future, I plan to take a trip to the UK aboard the Queen Mary 2 and film a lot of historic locations there so I can bring you all some new content. So if you'd like to see that happen as soon as possible, then you can support my trip by going to my GoFundMe page and donating to that. All the links that you need are in the description below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.